All right. So here we are again, and we're going to be talking about rate in this video. I have a couple other videos on interest rates because it's an important topic that just always keeps coming up. It's all about the rate, you know, and the rate does matter. However, obsessing over the rate before you even have a house can be a little like, negotiating the price of a tuxedo before you've even been invited to the wedding, you know? So it's all about the rate, right? Well, here are 7 things that actually affect your mortgage rate. Okay? So what is your interest rate? If you're buying a house, you're probably going to ask that question. It's usually one of the first questions that come up in literally every one of my conversations every day. And you should ask that question. But here's the rub. Here's the challenge. A lot of home buyers treat the mortgage interest rate like it's the only number that matters, like it's the only number that even exists. They'll spend 3 weeks calling lenders saying, who has the lowest rate? I'm shopping lenders to see who has the lowest rate. And I'm thinking, you don't even have a house yet. It's a little like shopping for car insurance before you've decided whether you're buying a Honda or a Ferrari, or my personal favorite, a Bentley, despite its gas mileage. The rate does matter. However, the rate isn't the single number that everybody gets. There are actually 7 major factors that can affect the rate and pricing of your mortgage. And there's another big factor that you need to understand. Mortgage rates are tied to financial markets. A lot of people don't understand this, or they don't think about it. And so it's like, oh, really? This is like an aha moment on a lot of the calls that I get. Like, wow, I didn't realize that. That makes a lot of sense now. So, which means they move, and they move uh, throughout the day, just like stock prices, because they're tied to financial markets. So today, I'm going to explain why I don't obsess over your exact interest rate before you're under contract and ready to sign the initial loan disclosures. And why what's the lowest rate isn't always the best question to ask. All right, so factor one, the Captain Obvious moment here. We probably already understand this, your credit score, or your FICO score to be more precise. So let's start with this obvious one. Your credit profile matters, of course. And generally speaking, and just like all my videos, I'm speaking in general terms. Your specific situation is going to be different. Generally, borrowers with stronger credit profiles can qualify for more optimal mortgage pricing than borrowers with less than optimal or weaker credit profiles. So, hello, higher credit scores obviously are going to get more optimal terms, and rates. Why? Because it's all about the risk. Lenders are evaluating risk before we lend anybody money. And remember that. You're coming to us to borrow money from us, or more specifically through Fannie and Freddie or through FHA, but we're a direct lender, and that's a whole other thing. But if you were lending someone, let's say $400,000 of your money, would you rather lend it to someone with a long history of responsibility, managing credit, and paying back their creditors? Or somebody whose credit report looks like it was assembled during a particularly chaotic Tuesday? you know? Um, would you look into their credit? Which is another thing. Some people say, well, why do you need to pull my credit? Well, hello, you're borrowing hundreds of thousands of dollars from us. We kind of want to know that you have a history of paying back the people that you borrow money from. Pretty simple. Um, so your credit profile is one of the things that can affect the pricing of your mortgage. So before you start rate shopping, make sure your credit is shopping ready, you know? And the good news is we have a free resource that helps you improve your credit score. It's totally free. We're not doing the work for you. We give you access to this tool, and it gives you the steps to do it all yourself at zero charge, completely complimentary. So there is that. Now, factor two, where's the house? Here's one that surprises people, and it even surprised me before I got into this industry. Location matters. As they say, location, location, location. You know, the property location can affect your mortgage pricing. And we're talking about things like the state, the county, the city, and of course the zip code. And we all know some zip codes have higher taxes intrinsically than other zip codes. Some zip codes are more, we feel more comfortable going through there in the evening than other zip codes. You catching what I'm laying down? And there's other property characteristics. So if your friend says, well, I got a 6.25, well, that's great. But where are they buying? What are they buying? You know, and how much were they borrowing? What's their credit profile? What's their down payment? Because comparing your mortgage to a friend's mortgage, assuming that they're completely honest, comparing that without knowing the actual details is like comparing your Starbucks order to theirs and concluding, oh, coffee prices are unfair. So, factor number three, home price and loan amount. The amount you're borrowing matters. A $250,000 mortgage isn't necessarily going to be priced exactly the same way a $750,000 mortgage will be. And different loan amounts can fall into different categories with different underwriting and pricing considerations. Generally speaking, no, you know what? I'm not going to go there because that is conjecture and not really necessary. All right, so, but basically it matters. So when somebody tells you that, well, my lender gave me this rate, well, don't just ask, well, what rate? Ask, well, what was that loan amount? Because context matters. And factor number four, your down payment. It's all about mitigating risk. So your down payment can also affect your mortgage pricing. Generally, the more equity you have in the property relative to the loan amount, the lower the lender's exposure to risk. And at the end of the day, a lender wants to mitigate as much risk as possible. And that affects your pricing. But here's where I want you to be careful, okay? Listen to this. More down isn't automatically better, okay? Even though that sounds a little counterintuitive, because I don't want you taking every dollar that you saved, dumping it into the house, and then moving into your beautiful new home with only $17.42 in your checking account. You still need money for the closing costs, which aren't talked about enough in my opinion. You still gotta factor in moving expenses, potential repairs, emergency reserves, life, entertainment, because apparently, houses occasionally break things. And if you have a family and if you got young boys, just saying, your down payment should be part of the overall financial strategy, not simply a race to put down as much as humanly possible. You got to leave some for other pieces of the puzzle. So factor number five, your assets and reserves. So here's one that many buyers don't even think about. And so how much money do you have left after the transaction? Your assets and your financial reserves can matter in the overall underwriting and risk assessment. Think about the difference between two buyers. You got buyer A, I'm putting everything I have into this house, versus buyer B, I have the down payment, the closing costs, and substantial reserves remaining. Wow, okay. Well, those are two very different financial profiles. Having reserves can provide additional financial strength and may be relevant to loan eligibility and pricing, depending on the scenario. And personally, I like the idea of you having some money left over after you get the keys. Because the first thing your new house will probably do is ask you for more money. I know every house that I bought sure did. You go in, you're like, you know what? I kind of would prefer these other fixtures that we saw at the store versus the ones that the house came with. And that list can go on and on and on. You probably know what I'm talking about. All right, so another item is fixed or adjustable rates. So the rate type matters. You've probably heard fixed rate mortgage or adjustable rate mortgage. With a fixed rate mortgage, the interest rate is generally fixed for the term of the loan, so you don't have to worry about that changing. The principal and interest stays as same amounts, as you're paying it down, of course. An adjustable rate mortgage, or ARM, can have an initial fixed period and then adjust according to the terms of the loan. You've probably heard the terms like 5-7. Well, that stays fixed for 5 years, and then it would adjust for every 7 months or every 6 months, whatever the terms are. All right, so the different rate structures can have different pricing. So again, when somebody says, I got a 5.7 rate, my question is, on what? And because a 5.75 rate on one type of mortgage isn't necessarily equivalent to a 5.75% on another mortgage. It's like saying I bought a house for $500,000. Okay, well, where at? How big? What was the condition of this house? How many bathrooms? Is there a swimming pool? Details matter. It's like somebody who says, "Oh, I bought a Chevy for $20,000. It was such a deal." But then you find out, oh, well, that Chevy was a '67 Stingray. Okay, yeah, that makes a big difference in that equation. All right. So factor number 7, the loan term. Oh, and before I get to factor 7, the other thing about fixed rate versus ARM is how long will you stay in the house? If you're going to stay in it less than 7 years, but longer than 6 months to a year, longer than a year, but less than 5 to 7 years, then that ARM may make a sense to you. But if you plan on staying in there longer than, the 7 years or whatever, you probably want to stay with a fixed mortgage because you're going to stay in there longer. All right. So factor number 7, the loan term. The length of your mortgage can also affect pricing. For example, a 30-year, 20-year, 15-year. I've seen them as low as 10-year. Different loan terms can have different interest rates. And shorter loan terms can often have lower interest rates and substantially lower total interest costs over the life of the loan. But here's the trade-off. Lower rate doesn't necessarily mean a lower payment. A 15-year mortgage may have lower interest rate, but you're paying that loan back in half the time. So your monthly principal and interest payment will be considerably higher. And that's why I don't want you chasing the lowest rate. Now, there's been times where we get into a loan, we're in processing, and then some things pop up with a person's credit. And they're like, okay, well, to get this actually to fire, that's our internal term. We're looking for the term approved eligible. Well, we can't get it to be AE, approved eligible. So let's try some different scenarios. Okay, well, let's try a 20-year. Let's try a 25-year to get them into the house. And then after 6 months, you can always refinance back into a 30-year fixed after you've made on-time payments and your credit is improved and so on and so forth. But sometimes we have to go to a 25-year or a 20-year because of a credit scenario to help you get into that house. Just an interesting side note. So, back to why I don't want you chasing the lowest rate. I want you looking at the right loan for your financial situation. And no, I cannot just give you a better rate because I like you. There's a lot of federal regulations around this industry. Thank you, 2007. And so here's another important thing you need to understand about mortgage rates. Your loan officer doesn't get to sit there and just arbitrarily say, you know what? I really like this person. Let's give them a 5.75. Or in my case, you know what? I'm a Marine Corps vet. I have a strong affinity to my veterans and even more so with fellow Marines. It just is the way it is. You know, it is what it is. However, I can't just arbitrarily give them a better rate just because I like them. There's federal guidelines, and the rates are given to us by um, rate sheets, and a lot of factors that go into that that are just out of our control. The rates are the rates. It is, we have zero control. So like I said, I can't give you a 5.75 when the rate sheet says, okay, yeah, it's a 6.8. And then, because I like you. And then go to this other guy and say, oh man, yeah, he was Army. I really didn't like him. Or you know what? This person was giving me a lot of grief and a lot of attitude. So you know what? Yeah. You get a 7%, buddy. No, that's not how mortgage pricing works. That's not how any of this works. If you've seen that commercial. Um, Mortgage lenders have specific pricing guidelines and eligibility requirements that determine the rate and the pricing available for a particular loan scenario. So it's not like who has the lowest rates. We all have the exact same rates. Okay? Your loan officer cannot legally decide to give you a better rate because you're nice, because you're a friend, or give you higher rates because they don't like you. Or can't give you a better rate because you brought us cookies or snickerdoodles, um, or because we both went to the same football team, the same college, or that we're both Marines, you know, or because, whatever the reason. We have to treat borrowers fairly and apply the applicable pricing and underwriting criteria consistently, regardless of any other factors. That means your mortgage pricing is based on the characteristics, the financial characteristics of the loan transaction and your financial profile, not whether we like you or any other characteristics. And this is actually a very great thing because you don't want your mortgage rate determined by somebody's mood. Imagine walking into the lender's office and they're having a bad day or they're having a good day. Either way. Good morning. How are you today? Loan officer. Fantastic. Great. What's my rate? Oh, 5.875. Next person walks in. Hey, how are you doing? Loan officer. Oh, terrible. What's my rate? Oh, 7.25. Thankfully, it doesn't work that way. And here's why this matters. When you're comparing lenders, don't assume that this lender likes me more so that they're going to give me a better deal. Instead, compare apples to apples. Look at the interest rate. Look at the annual percentage rate, which is the interest rate and the annualized rate with all the fees added in. Look at the discount points. One thing that a lot of people don't understand is the point, quote unquote, the points, the discount points. Every interest rate comes with a certain number of points. Every lender has them. They may not disclose them to you, but it's just part of the interest rate. It is what it is. If you don't want points, then expect to get an 8-point interest rate or an 8% interest rate. Lender fees. Ask them about the lender fees. Ask about the loan type, the loan term, down payment, estimated payment, and then the overall cost of the financing. Those are things that you need to look at because a lender advertising a lower rate may be accomplishing that through points, fees, different loan assumptions, or a different loan structure. So don't just ask, hey, what's your rate? Ask, what does it cost me to get that rate? That is a much better question. And I made another video on another question that you may want to be asking before, rather than the rate, until you find that dream house. There's another number that you really should be looking at. And I made another video, so check out that other video. All right? So that brings us back to why I don't obsess over the rate before you're under contract. Because until we know the actual property, the purchase price, the loan amount, the down payment, the loan program that you're on, if you're on a down payment assistance plan, which those will add an additional cost to that loan, just because that's the way it is. No lender has any control over that. If you're on a down payment assistance plan, expect to pay more. And I made another video on that topic. So until we know all of the characteristics of the transaction, we're still working with an estimate. As annoying as that is, it's still an estimate. So once you have a house under contract, then we can start getting more precise. And when we're ready to process the loan, we can lock the rate based on the pricing available for your specific scenario at that time. So yes, the rate matters, but not the only thing that matters. And it's definitely not something that your loan officer, regardless of what company they're with, can pull out of their hat because they like you. Okay? And now, the big one, the financial markets. Here's the part that surprises a lot of people. Mortgage rates aren't simply sitting on a shelf waiting for you. And regardless of what the Fed chairman comes out and says on any given day, that doesn't really impact the mortgage rates as much as other things. They're influenced by financial markets. And those markets move continually throughout the day. Economic data comes out, inflation numbers change, employment reports come out, bond markets move, investor expectations change, and mortgage rates can respond. Which means the rate I quote you today at this specific time will not be the rate available tomorrow, let alone next month or next year, when you're saying, oh, well, I'm not really looking. I just want to see what the rates are today before I start, and I'll be ready next year. Well, okay. The rates change multiple times throughout the day. And that's why I don't want you spending 3 weeks calling, 20 different lenders, or calling me back and saying, Richard, can you beat a 6.375? And I'm thinking, yeah, which house are we buying? Are you under contract right now? Because until you have a property under contract, we don't know the entire loan scenario. And until we get the title company assigned, and really they're the ones that are chasing down a lot and getting a lot of the numbers firmed up and more accurate. They're the ones that are tracking down what the property taxes are going to be, and so on and so forth, to get in, to really nail in and narrow in on those costs. So why don't I focus on your exact rate yet? This is probably the most important part of the video. So if you're going to take anything away, here's the part. When you're just beginning the home buying process, we're working with estimates. We're looking at your income, your assets, and your credit profile, your estimated purchase price, your estimated down payment, potential property taxes, homeowner's insurance, potential mortgage insurance, potential HOA, estimated interest rates. And that allows us to determine what your payment will be and what are you comfortable with. That is really a big thing. What are you comfortable with paying after you pay all of the other monthly expenses? That's the number I really want you to know. And I made a whole other video on that topic. Because imagine you tell me, hey, Richard, I need my total monthly payment around $3,000. Fantastic. Now we can work backwards. Instead of saying I need the lowest rate, we can say, All right, let's structure the financing so the payment fits your budget. That is a much more useful and optimal conversation to have. And regardless of rate, because if you don't like the rate today, you can always refinance within 6 months of buying the house. If the rate goes down. So then you find the house. Now that you have the house, your offer gets accepted. Congratulations! Now we're in step 3 of the 3-step process of buying a house, the most fun part. Now we have an actual property, we have an actual purchase price, and if you had a great real estate investor, they got you seller concessions that'll cover the closing costs. We know what the actual loan amount is, the down payment, actual property taxes. Well, we'll narrow in on the actual property taxes through the loan processing. And as you shop for your homeowner's insurance and you get that premium figured out, we'll know what that number is. And if there's an actual HOA, we'll be able to add that in. And all the third-party costs become more knowable as we move through the process. And a lot of those are determined by the title company because they're the ones that are doing a lot of that work. Now we're no longer talking about what if. We're talking about this house. And that's, when we can get a lot more precise about your financing. And then we lock in the rate. And then at that point in step 3 of this home buying process, that's when we do the hard credit check to get a deeper dive into your financial picture. Once you're under contract, we're ready to move forward with processing. I hand it over to the processing team and they basically take over from here. We lock in the interest rate based on the available pricing and your specific loan scenario. And that's when the rate becomes a much more meaningful number because now we know what we're actually financing. And this is why I don't want you losing sleep over whether today's rate is 6.375 or 6.25 or 6.75 or 6.875. When you don't even know what house you're buying yet. So here's the big takeaway. Is the interest rate important? Absolutely. But it's only one piece of this mortgage puzzle. Your rate can be affected by, like I said, here's a recap. Your rate can be affected by your credit score, property location, home price and loan amount, the down payment, the assets and reserves that you have, the rate type, whether it's fixed or adjustable, whether you're using a down payment assistance program, and the loan term. And then the financial markets, which is what it's tied to, which can cause rates to move throughout the entire day. So instead of asking me, what's your lowest rate? I'd rather that you ask, what mortgage payment am I comfortable with? And what loan structure gets me there? And how much are the closing costs? Which generally the national average is 6% of the purchase price is what we estimate for closing costs. And most of that is third-party fees, which no lender has any control over. So anyway, if you're thinking about buying a house, and just don't spend the next 6 months collecting interest rate quotes like Pokemon cards. All right? Same thing with the pre-approval letters or the pre-qualifications. People say, oh, well, I've already gotten 6 pre-qualifications. I just wanted to see what your rate was. We're not Pokemon cards. Find a lender and work with that lender. And unless they're really treating you bad, or giving you, whatever the case is, just stick with the lender because we all have access to the same rates, period. So let's figure out your numbers first. Let's figure out what you qualify for, what you're comfortable with paying, and how much cash you want to use. Because you got to leave some left over for all the moving expenses, the closing costs, buying new furniture that'll fit better in the new home than what you currently have. You know the drill. And then let's go find that house. And once you're under contract, that's when we get serious about the exact rate and locking it in. So I'm Richard Sailing, a licensed loan officer. If you found this helpful, and I hope you did, please like the video, smash that like button down below, subscribe to my channel, share it with someone who is shopping for a house and you think that they could use this information. And remember, don't obsess over the rate. Understand your payment, understand the loan, understand the numbers, because the goal, your desired outcome, isn't to win the lowest rate, contest. Your desired outcome is to buy the right house with the financing that you can comfortably afford. So until next time, have an awesome day.